1947, they found her in a mansion that smelled like mothballs and old money. Evalyn Walsh McLean, heiress to a Colorado gold mine, owner of the most famous gemstone in recorded history, wife to a man who would die in a psychiatric ward. She was found alone. Not alone in the romantic sense, not the tragic heroine kind of alone that fills novels. Alone in the clinical sense, the kind that accumulates over decades, quietly, until one day you look up and the rooms are full of nurses instead of friends. The kind where your children stop calling, because two of them are already dead, and the third one has become a stranger. She was 60 years old. She had lived 100 terrible lifetimes inside that one body. The newspapers called it the Hope Diamond Curse. That's the comfortable narrative, the fairy tale explanation that lets everyone off the hook. A stone, a hex, a supernatural force pulling beautiful, wealthy people into the dark. But here is what I want you to sit with today. What if the curse wasn't the diamond? What if the curse was the system that produced Evalyn Walsh McLean? The Gilded Age architecture of transactional marriages, performative wealth, and the specific, documented psychological violence done to women who dared to inherit rather than marry into money. Today, we are going to do something the history books rarely do. We are going to deconstruct Evalyn Walsh McLean. Not celebrate her, not romanticize her diamonds and her parties, not reduce her to a cautionary tale about hubris. We are going to examine what the Gilded Age's machinery, commercial marriage, inherited guilt, mineral wealth, actually did to a specific human nervous system over the course of 6 extraordinary, catastrophic decades. And we are going to ask, with the second Gilded Age now fully upon us, whether anything has actually changed. Let's begin at the beginning, which, in Gilded Age America, almost always begins with dirt. Specifically, the dirt under someone else's fingernails. Thomas Walsh was an Irish immigrant, shrewd, relentless, constitutionally incapable of accepting failure. He struck gold in Colorado, then silver, then gold again. His Camp Bird mine in Uray County would eventually yield an estimated $28 million in ore. In today's terms, approximately $1 billion. The men who dug that ore out of the mountain earned between $2 and $3 a day. Thomas Walsh built a 60-room mansion in Washington, D.C. with the proceeds. He filled it with Flemish tapestries, Japanese porcelain, and a daughter named Evalyn, born in 1886, who would be raised to understand, at a molecular level, that money was the primary language of love. This is the first illusion we need to interrogate. The mythology of the mining heiress, especially in Gilded Age America, was constructed as a kind of fairy tale. The rough frontier father, the beautiful daughter elevated into society, the transformation of raw American capitalism into something resembling aristocracy. It's still being sold to us today, repackaged as self-made narratives for tech founders whose parents funded their first companies. But here is what the fairy tale omits. Evalyn Walsh was not simply given wealth. She was given wealth with conditions attached. From the earliest age, she was a financial instrument, an avatar of social mobility, a vehicle through which her father's extractive fortune could be laundered into respectability. When Evalyn was 17, the Walsh family was involved in a carriage accident in Newport, Rhode Island. Her brother Vincent, her closest companion, the one person she described in her memoirs as genuinely seeing her, was thrown from the vehicle. He did not survive. I want you to mark this moment. because it is the first data point in a pattern that will repeat itself with almost mechanical cruelty throughout her life. The people Evalyn Walsh McLean loved most were taken from her, and the wealth remained. The money was always there, standing in the hallway, waiting, indifferent. Evalyn Walsh entered adulthood wealthy, grief-fractured, and extraordinarily visible in Washington society. She was not merely rich, she was mining rich, which, in the social taxonomy of the Gilded Age, carried a specific kind of stigma. Old money families, the Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Belmonts, tolerated the nouveau riche of the mining and industrial fortunes. They did not respect them. The dirt was too recent, the calluses too metaphorically present. And so the Gilded Age offered an elegant solution to this problem, elegant in its brutality. Marry upward, trade the money for the name. Enter Edward Beale McLean, or, as Evalyn's friends and family referred to him, with increasing frankness over the years, Ned. Ned McLean was 20 years old when he married Evalyn Walsh. By every documented account, he was a functional alcoholic with a gambling addiction, a pathological aversion to responsibility, and the specific psychological profile of a man who had been given everything and valued nothing. He was exactly what the system was designed to produce, and he was exactly the transaction that Gilded Age social architecture had built Evalyn Walsh to enter. There is a word that historians and psychologists use for the specific dynamic that characterizes many Gilded Age elite marriages: complementary dysfunction. It sounds clinical, almost neutral. It isn't. What it describes, in the case of Evalyn and Ned McLean, is the way two people with fundamentally incompatible wounds can become structurally dependent on each other in ways that amplify rather than heal those wounds. Evalyn Walsh McLean was a woman with an excess of agency and very few legitimate outlets for it. She was brilliant. She was strategic. She understood people with an almost uncomfortable accuracy. She had inherited not just her father's money, but his prospector's instinct, the ability to read terrain, to identify where the value was buried, to take calculated risks. And she had been told, explicitly and implicitly, from the moment she was born, that none of that counted without her husband's name attached to it. Ned McLean was a man with an excess of entitlement and absolutely no mechanism for tolerating the limitations of reality. He drank, he gambled, he was constitutionally incapable of managing the media empire his family had built. He would later become famous for his involvement in the Teapot Dome scandal of 1922, one of the most significant government corruption cases in American history before Watergate. He claimed he had lent $100,000 in cash to Interior Secretary Albert Fall. He lied about it under Senate investigation. He was caught. He survived because men of his class and era usually did. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In the early years of their marriage, Evalyn and Ned performed wealth with a dedication that borders on the pathological. Their honeymoon alone cost $200,000. They traveled through Europe like visiting royalty, which, functionally, they were. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia received them. They dined at tables most Europeans would never see from the outside. Back in Washington, their home, Friendship Estate, became the center of capital society. Senators, presidents, generals, they passed through those rooms the way power always moves, in groups, at night, over very expensive food. Evalyn McLean was, by any measure, one of the most socially powerful women in America. And then, in 1911, she bought a stone. The Hope Diamond has a history that is genuinely extraordinary and significantly embellished in roughly equal measure. Originally mined in India, almost certainly from the Kolar mine in what is now Andhra Pradesh, it was acquired by French merchant Jean-Baptiste Tavernier in the 17th century and eventually purchased by Louis XIV of France. The curse narrative was largely a confection. Jewelers and journalists in the 19th century designing mystique to increase price. Some marketing brilliance, honestly. Evalyn Walsh McLean knew this. She wrote about it in her memoirs. She called the curse nonsense. She bought the diamond anyway. In 1911, from Pierre Cartier, for approximately $180,000. She had it reset multiple times. She wore it to parties. She let her dog wear it. She once lent it to a friend for a costume party. This is where the surface narrative gets lazy and the real analysis gets interesting. Most accounts of Evalyn Walsh McLean and the Hope Diamond follow the same sequence. The coincidences, the dead son, the mad husband, the financial collapse. Line the events up, attach the diamond as causative agent, call it a story. But the stone didn't kill Evalyn's son Vincent. That was an automobile accident. June 1919. A collision on the road outside their estate in Friendship Heights. Vincent McLean was 9 years old. He died the same day. 9 years old. The same age her brother would have been if the carriage accident in Newport hadn't taken him instead of her. I need you to understand what it means, clinically, physiologically, in the specific chemistry of a human brain under sustained traumatic stress. To lose the people you love with this kind of systematic repetition. First her brother, then her son, then the slow, documented psychological deterioration of her husband, who would be committed to a psychiatric facility in 1933 after his behavior became impossible to conceal. Ned McLean died there in 1941. Their daughter, Evalyn Washington McLean, known as Evie, died of a drug overdose in 1946. She was 25 years old. Evalyn Walsh McLean responded to these losses the way the Gilded Age had trained her to respond to everything, by performing. The parties continued, the diamonds were worn, the guest lists grew. She opened her home to journalists, to politicians, to society columnists who would write about her jewels and her menus and her extraordinary vitality. But the memoirs tell a different story. In Father Struck It Rich, published in 1936, Evalyn Walsh McLean writes about her losses with a flat, clinical precision that is more disturbing than any amount of theatrical grief. She describes the system. She describes the loneliness. She describes, with the specific, clear-eyed analysis of someone who has survived long enough to recognize the mechanisms, exactly how wealth failed to protect her from anything that mattered. And then there's the morphine. This is the part that gets sanitized in polite historical accounts. Described as Evalyn Walsh McLean's health struggles, her reliance on medication. Let me be direct. Evalyn Walsh McLean was addicted to morphine for a significant portion of her adult life. The addiction developed in the 1910s, following a series of physical injuries and the standard medical treatment of the era, which treated pain with opiates as casually as we might prescribe ibuprofen today. This is not a moral failure. This is a medical reality. A woman who experienced an extraordinary concentration of physical and psychological trauma, treated by the medical establishment of her time with a chemical solution that created a secondary crisis. It is also a systemic failure. The same class privilege that gave Evalyn Walsh McLean access to the diamond also gave her access to unlimited medication, unlimited discretion, and an entire social apparatus dedicated to ensuring that her disintegration was never discussed in public. The curse wasn't the diamond. The curse was the silence. Let's step back from Evalyn Walsh McLean's specific tragedy and look at the architecture that produced it. Because individual suffering always has a structural address. The Gilded Age. The first one, running from roughly 1870 to 1900, though its social consequences extended well into the 1940s, was not simply a period of great wealth. It was a period in which the rules of wealth accumulation were being written in real time, often by the people accumulating it, with full knowledge that the rules would benefit them and cost someone else. The mining fortunes, Walsh, Hearst, Mackay, Fair, were built on a specific exchange: extreme risk, extreme exploitation, transformed by capital into extreme respectability. The men who owned the mines did not dig them. The men who dug them owned nothing. The women in this system, even the wealthy ones, especially the wealthy ones, served a specific function. They were the laundering mechanism, not in the crude financial sense, in the social sense. The mining baron's money was dirty, not metaphorically, literally. Its origins were visible and uncomfortable. A daughter elevated into the aristocracy of the East Coast, married to a newspaper family or a railroad family or an industrial family, performed a kind of moral laundering. The next generation would simply be wealthy. The mine would become a family legacy rather than a family source. This required that women like Evalyn Walsh McLean be simultaneously highly visible as social performers, hostesses, wearers of famous diamonds, and completely controlled as daughters, wives, mothers, vessels for the reproduction of class position. Now, I want to be precise about what this pattern looks like when it repeats. We are living right now in what multiple economists, including Thomas Piketty and the team at the Economic Policy Institute, have documented as the second Gilded Age. The wealth concentration at the top 0.1% of the American economy now mirrors, and in some metrics exceeds, the wealth concentration of the 1890s. The new mining barons are, in some cases, literally mining barons. Rare earth minerals, cobalt, lithium, the materials that power our devices, extracted from the earth by workers in the Democratic Republic of Congo, earning between $1 and $2 a day. The numbers have barely changed. Only the minerals are different, and the social machinery that processes this wealth into respectability? Watch for it. Watch the way tech fortunes are suddenly very interested in legacy media ownership. Watch the way billionaire marriages are covered by press ecosystems the billionaires frequently own. Watch the cultural rehabilitation of performative domesticity, the woman as social accessory and reproductive vessel, repackaged now for social media and newsletter platforms. Ask yourself whether the packaging is actually new. Watch the way opioid addiction devastated working-class communities for 3 decades, while the families who built their fortunes on manufacturing that addiction laundered their money through museum wings and philanthropic donations. The same exchange as Thomas Walsh. Different product, same math. Watch the silence. The silence around women in these systems who are medicated, isolated, performing vitality at parties while the private reality is something much colder. The curse isn't the diamond. The curse is the specific, reproducible set of conditions that produces women like Evalyn Walsh McLean, and then stands back and calls their destruction fate. Here is the final data point. In 1947, when Evalyn Walsh McLean died, her estate was in debt. The parties, the houses, the decades of performative abundance had cost more than the Camp Bird mine could ultimately bear. The Hope Diamond was sold to cover the debts. It passed through several hands before ending up, in 1958, in the Smithsonian Institution, where it has sat behind glass ever since. Visited by millions of people who read the placard about the curse and feel a small, comfortable thrill. The diamond outlived everyone. It is sitting in Washington, D.C. right now, in the city where Evalyn Walsh McLean once hosted senators and presidents in rooms that no longer exist. The stone endured. The woman did not. That's the complete record. There is a theory in trauma psychology called betrayal blindness, developed by researcher Jennifer Freyd. It describes the way people in systems that harm them often develop a kind of willful unseeing. Not stupidity, not weakness, a survival mechanism. If you see the betrayal clearly, you cannot function inside the system. So the mind learns to look away. I think about this theory often when I think about Evalyn Walsh McLean, because she saw it. Her memoirs make that clear. She understood the transaction. She understood what the diamond represented. Not luck, not curse, but currency. The ultimate symbol of a life organized around the performance of wealth rather than the experience of it. And she wore it anyway. She wore it because the alternative, to refuse the transaction, to step outside the system, to return the 45 carats and live some other kind of life, had no language in her world, no template, no precedent she could reach for. The Gilded Age built gorgeous prisons. It built them out of silk and marble and world-famous blue diamonds, and it put women inside them and called them lucky. The second Gilded Age is still building. The materials are different. The prisons are made of algorithms and wellness brands, and the specific social pressure to perform gratitude for a system that is, functionally, doing the same thing the Camp Bird mine did. Extracting maximum value from human beings, returning minimum dignity. And the women inside those prisons are still being told they are lucky. Evalyn Walsh McLean was not destroyed by a diamond. She was destroyed by a system that needed her to be decorative, reproductive, socially productive, and silent about the cost of all of it, and that provided her, when the silence became unbearable, with chemicals instead of honesty. The Hope Diamond is still at the Smithsonian. The men who built the Camp Bird mine have descendants who are very comfortable. And the question I want you to sit with, is the curse a story we tell because it protects us from the more disturbing truth that there is no supernatural force required to destroy a woman in this system? That the destruction is, and always has been, entirely human in its design? If that question stays with you after this video ends, sit with it somewhere quiet. Write something. Talk to someone. Look at the architecture of the world you're actually living in. And if you see what Evalyn Walsh McLean saw, leave it in the comments. I read them.